Thank you all very much for coming this afternoon. We're pleased to see you all here at this policy exchange event in the post-ed speech lull. So pleased to see so many of you here on discussing quite an interesting topic, I think, of why on earth does it cost so much to go to university. My name's Alex Bols. I'm Deputy Chief Executive at Guild HE, which represents some small specialist universities. I think it's been my task to facilitate this discussion, but both to give you lots of opportunities to hear from the panel, but also actually to give you plenty of chance to ask lots of questions yourself. Certainly when I was thinking about the question on the train on the way up, it seemed sort of pretty obvious to me. It costs quite a lot of money to actually deliver a course, and quite a lot of people want to do it. So that's pretty much it then. So, but certainly having been involved in higher education, first when fees were introduced in 1998, when then they were raised in 2004, but also more recently when they were increased to £9,000 in 2010, it reminded me of what a highly politically charged topic higher education funding is, and how much it resonates outside the walls of Westminster, how close actually we came in all three parliamentary votes to seeing the government losing votes, or certainly sort of going lots of back and forth. But particularly also when we see student debt rising, depending on which figure you look at, it's now probably somewhere around £50,000 a year, and the costs to the Treasury themselves also increasing. It seems like it's an issue that isn't going to go away. So it gives me a great pleasure to invite such a knowledgeable panel to explore these issues this evening. John Denham, on my left, is MP for Southampton Itchen and was previously Secretary of State for Innovation Universities and Skills, among many other positions, but has also made a number of very thoughtful contributions recently to the discussion. Carl, on his left, is the founding Vice-Chancellor of BPP University, which is a private university focusing primarily actually on business and the professions, and I also believe that BPP is sponsoring this event, so thank you very much indeed for that, Carl. Toni, on my right, is the President of the National Union of Students, and has actually recently been calling for a new deal for young people, and certainly that sort of chimed, I think, quite well with some of the things that Ed was saying early on in his speech this afternoon. She'll probably call me for saying it, but everyone has to say it. She's also the first president of the National Union of Students never to go to university, but before becoming president was vice president for further education, having been president of Cornwall College. And on the far right we have Jonathan Simons, head of the education unit at Policy Exchange. And certainly if you've been looking at the education policy sphere over the last few years, I'll certainly say that PX has been doing some really quite interesting work at all levels of the education sector and asking some quite challenging questions. I'm going to ask each of the speakers to speak for about 5 minutes or so, but as I say, I want to get as much chance for debate as possible, so we'll be relatively strict on the timing. So without further ado, John, why on earth does it cost so much to go to university?
Okay, fine. Well, by the way, this audience would have hoped there's a big section on universities in Ed's speech. There wasn't, but the relief of the panel is that we haven't had to rip up our speech notes at short notice and write something else. So, well, why? Because we waste so much money. And I'm here to be a controversialist. We run a system with waste money hand over fist, and it is poorly designed to get value for money and to deliver what the country needs. So this is my submission to Ed Bols' zero-based budgeting review. Now, why do I think it wastes money? It is intrinsic in a high-fee, high-loan system that you write off huge amounts of money that you borrow and you waste it. So every year, roughly speaking at the moment, the government borrows £10 billion and writes off £5 billion that it will never get back. Okay? If that money were put into tuition fees and teaching, fees would be much lower and people would be able to afford their fees. So that's the first reason that it's wasting £5 billion a year. Secondly, there's political inefficiency, by which I mean you introduce a high fees policy, then you put other money into the system which isn't teaching anybody anything in order to head off the political criticism you get for having high fees. So you put up maintenance grants and you require universities to spend about £600 million a year on widening access because you're so worried that you screwed up widening access by putting the high fees up. So this is all money in the system which is actually teaching anybody. It's an expensive model because it is becoming more and more a 3-year residential degree experience for 18-year-olds. Bols. This is the most expensive model of higher education that is available to us. This has been at the cost of part-time education. It's been at the cost of education for mature students. It's been at the cost of earn while you learn education. It's been at the cost of 2-year intensively taught degrees. We have a one-size-fits-all higher education experience in an economy which needs something completely different, and equally important, it wastes private money. A 3-year residential model assumes that it's not a proper university education unless you live away from home, which is extraordinarily expensive. The maintenance grants, let alone the loans, don't come anywhere near the cost of living. We've ignored every opportunity to try and create a university system where you can get an excellent university education from home if you wish to do so, right? We are a densely crowded urban population, urban country. More students are travelling away from home. More institutions are now recruiting nationally rather than locally or serving their regional economy. So we have structured in debt for students because of their living costs. And finally, because fees are much higher than they need to be, everybody's loan repayments are much higher than they need to be. Okay, so if fees were lower, you wouldn't. So we're wasting huge amounts of private money in an inefficient system. So the answer is it's cost because it's such a badly designed system. And so the trick quickly is, oh, and by the way, a third of graduates don't get degree-level jobs 5 years after they've been to university. There's falling real resources in universities. It's bad for real social mobility, by which I mean in my constituency, where still less than 30% of young people go to university, there's a huge number of older people who didn't get the chance to go to university. The absence of part-time and mature student education means they will never get the chance to go to university. So we've neglected them in the system, and postgraduate degrees are drying up. So what do? You take all, and I set some of this out in an RSA lecture in January, so I won't do the numbers, but conceptually you take all the money you're spending on higher education and you put it into teaching. What a radical idea. Why don't we spend all our money on teaching students something? Okay, that immediately brings the cost of higher education down. Then secondly, you use the money differently. You say to every student who goes into higher education, you are entitled to a flat rate sum of money to take with you to the university of your choice. It works out about £13,000–14,000. So the fee you have to pay is the difference between that entitlement and the university you go to. That means, roughly speaking, that if you went to a Russell Group university, you'd be paying fees of £12–14,000 a year. If you actually did a 2-year intensive degree close to home, you probably wouldn't pay more than £4,000 or £5,000 for a 2-year degree course to do it. The maths is in there. And thirdly, you take a set of that money and actually use it to fund what I introduced as Secretary of State, which is employer co-sponsored degrees, where the student gets a degree for nothing, the employer puts in. That works provided the employer cost at, say, £5,000 is less than the average cost of recruitment and retention of a graduate for an employer, which at that price it generally is. So you bring about those changes. What else do you have to do? You create incentives for universities to collaborate together, and you promote more 2-year intensive teaching courses. What you end up with is a system where nobody is worse off than they are at the moment. Most people are much better off. You have real strategies for reducing the students' living costs if they wish to do so. A higher proportion of your debt is repaid. In the university system, there is more money per student all the time than there is at the moment. You don't have to spend so much offer money on access because the cause of that being introduced in the first place can be fed back in. It's not without its problems. It is a less progressive system than the current one. Now, it seems to me it's hard to maintain the argument that you should have high fees so you then have a progressive repayment system. But actually, if you took the view that really successful graduates would now not be paying their fair share, here you can have a freestanding graduate tax unrelated to student loans to get people to make a proper contribution and more money into higher education. So we can do that.
Thank you very much. Lots in there. Carl, surely as a private university, it must be even more expensive to go to BPP.
I was just going to say, sign me up to John's Labour Party. I'm just so pleased to be able to sponsor this event. After I'd heard what John had said at the RSA lecture, I couldn't agree more. And I wanted to give the examples and the experience of BPP, which is a new provider in the university education sector, to illustrate some of John's points. BPP formed in the 70s. We educate about a third of all new entrants to the English legal profession, and about 2/3 of all accountants in the UK study with BPP at some point. We have about 10,000 university students studying in BPP University. Around about 20 to 25% are undergraduates. We first started offering an undergraduate degree in 2009. If you start to read some of the things from the Sutton Trust, graduates are going to be 50 by the time they pay off their debts. I've got 5 young children, and I look at how much money they're going to have to spend in order to get a university education. What are we teaching our children about the nature of debt if they have to take on so much debt in order to get a university education? And I can tell you that an undergraduate degree is merely a ticket to the dance. Given that most of my students are postgrad, you need a postgraduate education as well as an undergraduate education, and that's going to cost even more. If you want to know what removing the caps, as most vice chancellors in our sector are asking for, does, then look at the US. 5 times the rate of inflation is the fee inflation in higher education fees in the US. It's just not sustainable. So we've got to come up with a better method. And I think John has hit on something. First of all, the 2-year degree. In 2009, we launched the 2-year degree at BPP in law. We've now had 2 and 3 years worth of graduates going into Magic Circle law firms. So this is a new degree provider linking up with employers, offering 2-year degree programs. This 2-year degree program costs a total fee of £12,000 for a private profit-making provider to be able to provide a higher education that's accepted by the best employers in the field in the country at a total cost to students of £12,000. 51% of those students who take those courses don't even bother the student loan company. They go and find other loans because they don't want to take out a student loan. They live at home. The total cost of the degree is £12,000. So when John puts forward that 2-year degrees are possible, of course they are, but not if you bake in capital expenditure, which requires people to leave home, have expensive halls of residence, adopt a 3-year model of study that requires long summer breaks and summer holidays. That's not going to be the way forward for everybody. On social mobility, I agree with you around offer. I think one of the big issues that we've got is the dismantling of the careers and information service is leading to a lack of social mobility. I'm a first-generation kid, went to a comprehensive school, 1-parent family brought me up in South Yorkshire. I had some good support from my school that encouraged me that I could become a barrister. I can tell you that absolutely nobody in my family would ever have realised that I had that potential. We need a pushy parent behind every child in this country so that every child can fulfil their potential. Now, that I think is what's missing in terms of social mobility. I think there's ways of doing that with technology, with big data that exists at the moment. It doesn't have to be the old models that we've had. So I wanted to really just stand here and say, look, we're from the private sector, and it's taken somebody who's not in the club to come along and say, well, you're absolutely right. There's a different model that's lower cost, that can be respectable for employers, that delivers high quality. By the way, the survey of quality of teaching in law schools found that BPP is in the top 5 of all universities in the UK. So we've delivered high quality as well as low cost. And I think that model deserves to be looked at further.
Thank you very much. So it seems some of the options are more students studying nearer home, cutting out some of the efficiencies, possibly introducing some more private providers. Is this the way to bring down some of the costs of our higher education system, Toni?
I think some of them are. I think that I would absolutely agree with John, and I'm really pleased that we've been able to work really closely with John on developing some of these ideas around the money that we waste through the loan system. I think absolutely we need to reassess how our higher education system is funded, because it is frankly unsustainable at the moment, and the only person who seems not to be able to see that it's unsustainable is Greg Clark, which is unfortunate. And I think the really key thing here is that actually it does cost a lot of money. It costs a lot of money to taxpayers, but when you think about who those taxpayers are, they're the same people who are taking out these student loans for £9,000 a year. So this generation of students who have got these higher fees will pay for this 3 times. They'll be they'll have to take these loans out. They'll then have to repay them with interest, and they'll also then be the same taxpayers who make up the £94 billion black hole that the OBR are forecasting that will exist from the higher education funding system we've got at the moment by the early 2030s. And actually, I think the idea that we let this continue any longer is kind of absurd. The idea that we let that black hole get bigger and see it as a problem for the next generation to deal with, I think just kind of isn't good enough. But I think there's an important question here about why it costs so much. Because if we understand, as we're told by everybody, that now this new system of £9,000 tuition fees isn't saving us any money, is not good for the economics of the UK, it's not financially good for anybody involved, then what is the driver behind putting fees up? What is the driver behind the system of higher education funding we have at the moment? It's clearly not one that's designed to save the taxpayer money or to save students money. I think it's about driving an ideology, and two different types of ideology. One that says that you should pay for your higher education because there is no intrinsic public value to it. There is no value in it for businesses. There is only value in it to you, which I don't think probably anybody in this room would agree with. But also the kind of ideology, I guess, that that John and Carl have both talked a bit about, this kind of conservative vision and narrative, conservative with a small c, I guess, about what higher education is and what it should be, and what a university education is, and what education generally is and what it should be. The idea that the normal way of studying to the highest level is to undertake a 3 or 4 year undergraduate degree where you live away from home at the age of 18 and you have a full student maintenance and loan that covers the cost of your living, although it doesn't cover the cost of your living. That's what people see in their heads, and people think that's the usual route, or the traditional route. And I think that's one of the really important things about why our system costs as much as it costs, is because we have this traditional conservative view about what higher education looks like and what higher education students look like and who they are. And actually I think we need to challenge both of those ideologies, because I think that there is intrinsic public value in a higher education system, in educating people for a country that has to compete economically in we're not going to be competing at low skill levels anymore. We have to have the most well-educated people we possibly can in the UK, and that's why I'm really excited actually that our plans to have as many apprentices studying to higher education level qualifications as university students. I think it is genuinely exciting, because what that represents is a narrative that says that every young person in the UK should be educated to degree level, every single one, and that I think is something incredibly important and we should be really proud of. But I guess some of the other things that I think cost too much money. I said about the fact that your maintenance grant doesn't actually cover the cost of living. For an average student living in the UK outside of London, the shortfall between the maximum amount of student financial support you can get and the amount that it costs to live each year is £8,500. And where you're supposed to get that money from whilst you're studying, I think is a really interesting question. Because I don't think it is just about how much the system costs and why it costs that much, but who are the people who can afford to pay that much. Because it's only the people who can either afford to work almost full-time while they study, or to be supported by private finance, or to be supported by their parents, who can actually afford to live that kind of 18 to 21-year-old classic traditional university experience that we've talked about. I was the president of Cornwall College Student Union, which is a huge college and has around 3,000 higher education students studying at it, studying degrees that cost almost half the price of a average degree level qualification in a university, being able to study from home. And actually the really exciting thing about that for me was not that it was cheaper and not that it was a kind of two-year qualification, but that the kind of people I saw studying on my campus on those qualifications weren't the kind of people that you think about when you think about 18 to 21-year-old undergraduates. They were people like my parents who went to study, who went back to study, who would never have left Cornwall to study because they have families and careers. and wanted to return to get an education. And I think making the system as flexible as possible for students not only reduces the cost of the system, but also opens it up to mature and part-time students. And the fact that we don't talk very much about the huge drop in part-time and mature student numbers, I think it gets mentioned, but actually, why aren't we doing anything about that? I think is an absolute travesty. I guess the last thing that I would say is that I do think it's really important that businesses play their role, and the private sector in higher education plays its role, and the kind of non-traditional providers play their role in the higher education sector. But I do think it's really important that we address the regulation of the higher education sector, because that's another place that's costing us a huge amount of money. And this is absolutely not about institutions like BPP, but those institutions who run for profit, who are run to make money out of the student loan system, who have unlimited access to the student loan book, and who are causing a crisis in the funding of the Department for Business Innovation and Skills. And unless that is tackled with a higher education bill in the beginning of the next Parliament, we will see an even bigger crisis in the funding of the sector. So those, I guess, are some of my...
Thank you very much indeed. We've certainly had a number of speakers so far refer to sort of quite a traditional system, and certainly over the last few years we've seen increasing pressures for people to go down the full-time 3-year honours degree route. And certainly if you look at the numbers of both higher nationals, of foundation degrees, or the numbers even going down the higher apprentice route, certainly when then reflecting that against the leader's speech that we've just been hearing, there seems to be quite a lot of challenges there in terms of developing a tertiary sector where you actually do have real progression routes rather than forcing people into quite a particular system that we have already, a system that we've already heard is fairly unsustainable. Jonathan, do you have any answers on that?
Yeah, all of the answers. I just might not tell you them in the next 5 to 7 minutes. But rest assured, if I don't, then they will certainly come out soon. I guess the very short answer to why does going to university cost so much money is because it can. Why do universities, on the whole, almost all charge £9,000? Because they can. And one of the interesting things is, before I did this job in Policy Exchange, a couple of jobs ago, I was a civil servant. And one of the things I did when I was a civil servant, one of my more dubious pleasures as a civil servant, was I was a very small part of the team that had to respond to the Brown Review after the last election, and starting to think with ministers and politicians in the Treasury and the Cabinet Office and BIS, roughly in that order of priority, what exactly the kind of post-Brown system would look like. And one of the things which, hands up the politicians, not me, I was merely a civil servant, one of the things that the politicians absolutely got wrong was that they genuinely did think £9,000 would be the average, the exception. They genuinely did think that a market would be created, that there would be variable pricing, and that the various kind of things that people in this government like about markets would happen. And I think one of the biggest failures of HE policy has been the fact that that variable pricing has not come to pass. And so almost all of the assumptions were predicated on the fact that you wouldn't have as much student loans to give out, because if fees are lower, then student loans are obviously lower. And why do universities charge £9,000? Well, there's a lot of kind of psychology. Part of it is just basic economics. Why would you charge £6,000 if you can charge £9,000? You get, more money. But the other thing about it, which Vice Chancellor said, which in retrospect they must have been saying before 2010, but nobody really listened, was if you can charge £9,000 and you charge less, you look cut price, you look cheap, you look sub-quality. So why on earth would you, if you are a university that wants to give out precisely the opposite image, why would you charge less than £9,000? If you can, and also if all of your peers are also going to charge that. Because you worry about outpacing the market, but if frankly all of your peers are charging £9,000, then why don't you? You have no advantage in charging £6,000. So the market mechanisms which people thought might happen didn't really happen. I just want to touch on a couple of things, and the 3 previous speakers have said quite a lot of the things that I would say, so will adapt as I go on. I mean, I agree with a huge amount of what John said. I agree a lot about the perils of the non-flexibility of the system. I agree totally about the additional bungs that are thrown into the system. I think that's kind of the antithesis of what we should be spending public money on. I agree quite a lot. I've talked about kind of market pricing, and I agree a lot about kind of employer co-sponsored degrees and the need for more degrees. The only thing I disagree on, and John has a much more sophisticated analysis of what graduate tax looks like than some. And we haven't really talked about it tonight because it's not on the table from people like John, who's coming up with a much more thoughtful alternative. But a replacement of the current system with a pure graduate tax would be, in my view, a terrible mistake. Various reasons why I think a kind of pure graduate tax is a mistake. The first one is it has no relationship between the costs you incur and the costs you pay back. You know, at the moment, once you've paid back your loans, if you pay back your loans, you stop. Under a graduate tax, you pay, you know, till you stop paying tax. The second trouble with the graduate tax, and this is a really, really important problem, is that it breaks the link between you and your university. And from a university's perspective, it stops you being reliant on your student and makes you dependent on the largesse of the Chancellor of the Exchequer. And if I was a university Vice-Chancellor, I would not want to be dependent on the future largesse of the Chancellor of the Exchequer, because what he giveth with one hand, he taketh away with the other. And there's a real risk of future financial stability of universities if you are dependent on what a Chancellor might do. The third problem with the graduate tax is that anyone who's not a resident taxpayer in the UK, it's almost impossible to get the money back off them. Now, we don't have a great track record of reclaiming student loan repayments off people who leave the UK, but there is at least a mechanism to do it. There is basically no mechanism to reclaim tax. So I don't think a graduate tax is the right solution. I just wanted to kind of raise a couple of potential issues with John's plan, which, as I say, on the whole, I think is a really, really good plan. And I was just saying to Carl before we started, one of the difficulties in public policy is that you often get the most thoughtful contributions to public policy from people who are no longer in ministerial office and who do not have to fight an election. And I think it's a real shame that kind of this type of really intelligent, thoughtful contribution to what we might do about the AGS system has to come from people who are not necessarily in the kind of the position to make bits of it work. And it's fantastic that John can come out with this kind of stuff. It's a real benefit to the policy debate, but it's a real shame that, as I say, it has to come from people in that scenarios. Just a couple of things I would raise. One is the behavioural economics of a sticker price. And I talked a little bit before about kind of why would people charge £6 if they can charge £9. Now imagine if you were going to buy a car and there were two options. One is that the sticker price says 9,000, but the salesman says, all right, I'll do you a deal, I'll knock £3 off it, you pay 6. The other scenario is you go along and the sticker price is 6. The behavioural economics literature would suggest that the first one of those is more attractive, because subconsciously you anchor your thinking to this is worth £9,000 of value. And you further then benefit because you think you've got a good deal of 3k. So if we look at the current student loan model, that is essentially what happens. You rack up all this debt for the equivalent of 9k a year, but you know, or at least you know if you're rational, that actually the odds are you won't pay most of it back anyway. And I do think there's something interesting about a system that does start to value higher education in that way, because subconsciously you think if you're paying £9 a year, it's going to be worthwhile. And a second related thing to that is I do like the students as consumers movement that is starting to emerge. That is wildly unpopular, he says, generalising. It is wildly unpopular in most universities. And there is definitely a sense of, I mean, let's face it, sniffiness, that students should start to be coming to people and saying, hold on a second, what am I getting for £9,000 a year? How many lectures am I getting a week? How much access do I get to the library? What's my staff-student ratio? How often am I taught by postgraduates as opposed to by lecturers? You know, how often does the various things happen? I think that's a fantastic development. And I think that students as consumers, even in, let's face it, a public service that has a wider state benefit, is a really, really powerful thing. Because that's the way in which you continue to drive quality. So people like Carl and BPP are really, really hot on this. Because if, frankly, people don't start to kind of tell you what they want, then they start to vote with their feet. And, you know, frankly, in any kind of environment, whether you're in a public service or not, if your consumers or your students or your patients don't want what you want, then you start to get in difficulty. And I like that consumer model, and I think that's really, really powerful. And the last thing I just want to conclude on is, let's not forget the successes of the current 9K system. You know, let's not forget some of the apocalyptic predictions that were made when we went up to 9K fees. Let's not forget the apocalyptic predictions that student numbers overall would fall off a cliff. They haven't. Let's not forget the apocalyptic predictions that students on the most deprived quintiles would not go to university. They are going to university in record numbers. They're actually going more deprived students in England at 9K fees than in Scotland, where Alex Salmond says the rocks will melt in the sun before he'll charge fees. People are actually responding quite positively to a market. But overall, I do think there are questions to be asked. I think that some of the stuff that John has talked about is incredibly valuable. but I would urge us not to move to a graduate tax model and not to entirely discount the benefit of some kind of internal pricing.
Fantastic. Quite a lot of meaty issues that have already come up. I'll go straight to questions, but just to remind people, if we can ask questions rather than long statements, that would be appreciated. I'll try and take just questions. I'll take 4 to start with. So we start at the back. Please wait for the mic. And if you could state your name and where you come from.
Hi, I'm Kat Rose, Molly and Outwards CLP and Chair of Court Party Youth. I remember being at university when this debate was really kicking off in like 2009, 2010, and it's not an accident what happened with the £9,000 fees. I read the Russell Group's report at the time, and the Russell Group report, which is basically what was adopted, said that with £9,000 fees, the government should hide the money by underwriting debt in the same way they had with the railways. Yeah, so, I mean, that was already in there. Then we've got the thing where as soon as the fees were announced, all of the predominantly teaching universities had their funding cut substantially. So, whereas the research-based universities didn't.
What's the question that you'd like to
So, I mean, bearing in mind these problems already built into the system, how do you think we should go about fixing it?
Great, okay. I think there's another question at the back, just next to the other.
Hi, Jim Jones from Shrewsbury Constituency Party. Just really on the last point around would-be students as consumers, I think that's actually an incredibly powerful argument to say that students should be incredibly picky about the quality of universities. At the moment it isn't, because I think the university market is a false market, because you do not pay £9,000 up front for the product that you're getting in return. You get a loan, which for most students, and I do speak in the student cohort looking at getting to university, you do not, there's no intention to pay back £9,000 a year. It's a notional figure. It might as well be £100,000 a year, because there is no intention or recognition that you're actually going to pay it back. If you start making, and I don't know what the answer is, so I'm curious to see, but how do you make the university market back into a market and make it feel like a market? Because right now it doesn't feel like one. The realities of students and would-be students isn't there because that isn't the case, and universities aren't competing for that custom.
Perfect, thank you. We've got Brian up at the front.
Hello, Brian Lightman.
There's a mic just coming.
All right. General Secretary of the Association of School and College Leaders. Thanks very much for those really interesting inputs there. Really fascinated and very much agree with a lot of that. My question really, I don't know if I was being naive, but when this was first introduced, I expected one of the effects of these very high fees to be a sharp increase in the accountability of universities for the quality of teaching in particular. And from the perspective of school leaders, we are still hearing stories of students who are getting very small numbers of hours of teaching and so on for that very high fee. And I just wondered what the panel's views are about the accountability of universities.
Thank you. I'll take one more question just behind the Warden Times.
Janet Cohen, House of Lords, and let me hastily come clean, Chancellor of BPP University. One observation and one question. Why do university fees cost so much? We sweat our assets. There is about a week in the year when our buildings are not teaching students. There is no other university that can possibly claim that. They've got a lot of expensive real property standing around empty. The second thing, and this may be another elephant in the room, is, do we think there are too many universities? Universities would be cheaper if more people were gathered in the same place. And my impression is strongly that there are too many universities, not very good ones, being propped up. And I'd very much like to know particularly Mr. Denham's feelings on this.
Great, thank you very much. I'll start with Toni. There are a couple of questions there from Jim and Brian about the, indeed initially coming from Jonathan about the consumer, but also sort of the accountability in relation to teaching. Are students changing? Should they be more demanding?
I think I'm going to be completely honest. I think the idea of students as consumers is a bit of a joke. when I was really ill when I was growing up, I expected a really high quality of service from the NHS. I expected to be seen by a qualified doctor, and I expected to be treated properly and to be in good health. And I didn't expect that because I knew I was paying for it. I mean, I wasn't paying for it at the time because that's the joy of a publicly funded system. I don't think that you need to be a paying consumer to expect a high quality of service from an institution that you could pay for through your taxes. I think that we should expect the highest possible standards of our institutions, whether they're being paid for by taxpayers or paid for out of students' pockets, whether that's in the private sector or not. And I think that you should demand that level of quality as a student, because that's what's right for you as an individual, but it's also what's best for your institution and best for our economy and best for our society. Because frankly, if we have students who are going to universities who aren't getting a high quality experience, then there is no point in paying for it through a public system. And I also think that the idea that students are need to roll up to their institution and demand certain things because that's what they think means quality, I think is a really important issue to kind of get under the skin of, because when we talk about quality, we so rarely talk about the actual purpose of a university, the actual purpose of an education system, rather than just how many contact hours am I getting, and therefore how much am I paying per hour. Well, actually, there are lots and lots of ways of getting a really high quality education, and the way that you should deliver that is in partnership with your students, for lecturers and students to talk about what their expectations are of their institution and their education, and then do their best together to deliver that. Because this isn't a service model where you turn up, and this is an example that's used quite a lot, but it's not like buying a tin of beans where you just return it if you don't like it, because you're investing not just your own money but 3 years, if not more, of your life in this. And I guess there's also something really interesting, I suppose, about this idea that there were all these kind of horror stories about what would happen with this system, and student numbers would fall off a cliff and all of that. But I do think that there is, you can't kind of, I don't think this is an exact science, and you can't make kind of scientific comparisons between what happened and what would have happened if we didn't have £9,000 tuition fees, given that we are in one of the deepest economic recessions, or we were in one of the deepest economic recessions this country's ever seen, like almost 1 million young people unemployed. Actually, I think that there are so few opportunities for young people to find work, that going to university became an opportunity for them, and maybe the only opportunity that was available. I don't think you can make exact comparisons between having the system and not having the system. And just quickly on accountability, I do think that institutions should be more accountable to their students, and I think that some of the work that's been done recently on looking at how we make them more accountable is really important, but I think that should be done through students being able to organise together through student unions. I mean, I would say that. But also that I think it's really exciting that the Labour Party are talking about extending the remit of the Office of the Independent Adjudicator to private providers, and I think that being able to make institutional complaints to an independent adjudicator is a really important part of accountability in the system.
Carl, what's it like at BPP? Are they consumers?
Well, yeah, unabashedly, and they've got significant power, and BPP is subject to the OIA as a private provider, so not all private providers are the same in this world. I think the issue around accountability and the variability of universities, we're just about to see, I think, the tip of the iceberg of a problem. Everybody picked up on the OECD data last week that suggested that we had a sustainable system. But what I thought was more interesting is the data that came out that's saying levels of, or higher levels of literacy had not improved. And that sort of suggests we've got lots of people going to university, but they're not necessarily getting any better when compared to our European neighbours. And I think that might be an indication or an early forewarning of a problem, that university is not properly preparing people for the next stage. In terms of how we fix it, I think John hit the nail on the head in his RSA lecture. There's no downward pressure on fees. First of all, before we start to increase fees, let's make sure we're getting value for money out of what we are doing. I've written extensively about how much a degree costs when you start to look at the inputs. It does not cost £9,000 a year to teach a degree programme. Something else is going on with that money, and it's not directly the teaching costs and the unit of cost that's needed for the premises and the library and all this. I do not believe it. I have worked for the last 18 years in a company that has to make profit out of its bottom line, and I can do an analysis of cost and losses, and I'm pretty sure that the way in which things are standardised, something else is going on with the cash, and it should not cost that amount of money. So I think the first thing is make sure we're getting value for money out of what we got.
I might just take a couple of comments in relation to this question of consumers before I come back to Janice and Kat's question. So comments specifically about consumerisation. We had a couple of hands go up at the front, presuming to respond to Carl or to Tony. But,
James Moore, James Moore, PPC, Rutland and Melton, working at the sharp end as a historian at Leicester University. 2 points really come to mind. The first is, where does research sit in all of this? Because that's the elephant in the room. Universities are not just about teaching 18 to 21-year-old undergraduates. They have a lot of other functions as well which have to be paid for somehow, and we need to have an honest debate about that. Secondly, I'd like to ask the question about really, is it really too expensive? Because at the moment, whether we like it or not, actually internationally, British universities are very highly regarded. I've worked in various parts of the world, including America and the Middle East, and frankly, my experience of work is that British universities, in my personal experience, are at the very top. And yet we pay £9,000 in fees in the UK for an undergraduate degree. You go to some American state universities and it's higher than that. You go to Harvard and it's a heck of a lot more than that.
£57,000
So
a year.
I think actually from that point of view, an Oxford or a Cambridge or a Manchester degree for £9,000 compared to what's available in America is actually pretty good. I don't know, you can talk to my Vice Chancellor, but I don't think you'll find that British universities are rolling in money. So I think the conundrum here is research. I don't know how much research BPP does or how it contributes to the research communities across the country. I won't make a judgment about that. Certainly, the private universities I've worked for, frankly, don't prioritise research. And we're only going to be a world leader if we prioritise research as well as teaching in the university environment.
Great. Thank you. I'll take a couple more, particularly on this topic that we're sticking on. So Mike, and
yeah, sure. Just very quickly, I work in a post-92 university. I know a lot of colleagues who do. I've worked in Russell Group universities. On the consumerism point, John, I think, I wouldn't like that language either, Tony. But I do agree with John in terms of it's good that it drives up certain aspects, like pushing students, pushing for more contact hours. However, I've heard lots of horror stories throughout the sector, and I studied in an American university where this was commonplace, that actually the fear of particular perverse incentives in the system, the NSS, for instance, within the context of assessment cycles, let's not go too hard on the students during when the NSS is going on because we don't want negative NSS feedback. I hear that from a number of universities, because if recruitment drops on the back of the NSS, then people are going to get sacked, etc. These kinds of things have become perverse incentives, and I wonder if there's a correlation between that and what Carl talks about in terms of the OECD report on literacy rates. There is a sense in which I think these pressures can be managed in a way that does deliver greater efficiency and greater quality. But is it the case, do private providers agree, that we actually need to strengthen regulating? We need to strengthen the QAA to provide a different kind of incentive to make sure that works.
thank you. Then one more point on this particular question. The woman at the
Sorry, 3 quick points. I'll shout. I've got a good voice.
it's for the video rather than.
One I'd ask of John Denham, what happened in the good old days when I went to university? You paid no fees, and you got a very nice grant, thank you very much, from somewhere, I assume the local authority. I would have not gone to university otherwise. 2, I agree with the person at the back. I mix a lot with young people, and I haven't met anybody who has the remotest possibility of repaying. To them, it's beyond their imagination. So you're going to be chasing debt, and no doubt that'll cost money. 3rd, my roommate in 1 year, in the good old days, she had 1 seminar a fortnight, 1 summer term, and that was a total input from the academic people at a college in London University in those days.
Thank you. John, are there too many universities? What about good old days?
Well, the good old days. I mean, I'm old enough to. I'm old enough to have been part of the good old days. So it's and yes, that's right. And about 8% of us had the chance to go to higher education in any form whatsoever. And we could go back to 8% of students going to higher education, and we could pay a free education and pay fees. The chances of us being able to recreate that for 50% of the population is just not conceivable and wasn't under the Labour government. Don't forget, when Labour put in fees, it was a top-up to the highest ever levels of public finance of higher education. It wasn't a substitute for public spending in the way this government actually tried to do, although they failed. Two other quick points. I believe in student choice, and I'm a total skeptic about the idea of market forces driving up standards in public services. I think it was an ideological, fashionable idea in the last 20 years, which has been proven not to work in area after area. Now, we shouldn't get rid of choice just because we don't think markets actually drive up standards. So we should drive up standards, but the regulatory route is likely to be as good as anything else. The competition at the moment is producing all sorts of things. Universities are building halls of residence and things like that that look good to parents on open days. There's money going, investment in making the place look better that is not going into teaching, and that is one of the perverse effects and the money wasting effects of what we've got at the moment. Are there too many universities? No, there aren't too many universities. There's too much fragmentation. There's too much market competition. So if I look at my area of the country, and I was getting in trouble with all the vice chancellors for saying this, but I come from Hampshire, right? If we were in the States, it would be a state university of Hampshire. Bournemouth, Southampton, Solent, Portsmouth and Winchester would be a single institution. You could study at any site. Southampton would still be the top 100 group of research universities. Portsmouth, a huge sense of applied science. Winchester, a liberal arts college. Solent, a bit like an American community college, to be fair, Solent much more than that. Bournemouth, great specialisms in theatre and the arts and things of that sort. But you'd be able to do a bit of a degree at one place. You could study part-time for a bit. You could do a year at one particular site. The qualifications would be recognised. Our fragmentary, competitive-based system makes that completely impossible. And the third thing I want to say is that the research point is absolutely critical, and I'm not saying my model is at the end of the debate, it's not, but one thing I aimed to produce was a model where the fee was lower, but the resource into the university was higher. I think if a student was, say, paying £3,000 or £4,000 a year for their degree, they would worry less that part of the funding of the university was going to research. If you're paying £9,000 a year, you want to know that every bloody penny of that £9,000 is going into your teaching. And that does create a problem, because most, there's a limited degree to which essentially vocational, higher level vocational degrees can be separated out. Whatever your view of private education, I think it's ridiculous that the publicly funded education didn't do what BPP are doing, is my personal view, so that may be where competition does stimulate a bit of alternative thinking. So you should be, we're not likely to get more money for higher education. So you've actually got to use the public money we've got better if you want to sustain both good teaching and research. And my final point is this, and it's an issue about university culture. I think I'm now convinced that the average Vice-Chancellor, if they had a £9,000 fee and got an institutional income of £400 million a year, or was told that they could have a £5,000 fee and a £450 million income, would choose the £9,000 fee because they think it makes their university look more impressive. There is a real thing called fee envy amongst a number of Vice-Chancellors at the moment, where you measure your university by the size of your fees. We have got to break that culture.
I was particularly struck by John's second point. Certainly if you look at the number of university prospectus, every university is trying to become a world-class university, rather than actually looking at the system as a whole and how the interconnections within it fit together. Jonathan, I don't know if you wanted to pick up on maybe the research business on the other point.
Yeah, I always sort of say when I come to these events that I won't sort of end up being painted as this kind of complete free market zealot, because
and then I say something.
I know, and then somebody says something and I sort of feel the need to defend it. And I think it's a sort of slightly odd situation we find ourselves in. So to come to Tony's point, which is that you don't need to have consumer power to raise standards. You can do that through accountability or the largesse of the state or cooperation in some form. Yes, of course you can. But pretty unequivocally, across the world, in most areas of public and private services, the evidence is that some form of bottom-up choice, competition, contestability, accountability, call it what you want, the evidence is pretty unequivocal that that works better. And this is not a private thing. It's a sort of slightly bizarre debate that we're having where we sort of ignore what the Labour government did in the NHS, where we had choice and competition and overall, mortality rates went down, people got treated for free in some great private sector centres, the fact that people had choices of where they wanted to go, the fact that you had more treatments than ever before, was in large part, yeah, thanks to a great increase in public spending, but also in large part because we recognised that market forces played a role. Similarly in schools, you know, let's not ignore that since 1988, parents have had the right to express a preference for where they want to go to school, in amongst various other things that have radically improved school standards since 1988, has been the bottom-up pressure that parents and pupils have placed on schools. So we sort of have this debate in the abstract that, oh, we can't possibly have consumerism in universities because, you know, students can't pick the right outcomes and they're seduced by flashy accommodation blocks and swimming pools. I just find it's a kind of slightly bizarre, patronising attitude that sort of recognises that people who are, you know, by definition very smart because they're about to go on to tertiary education somehow can't work out what's good for them, or somehow can't see beyond a flashy prospectus and an Olympic-sized swimming pool. I just find it's a kind of sort of really bizarre attitude that, as I say, doesn't accord with the kind of the evidence to the rest of the world. So, you know, I think we can have that form of consumerism, and I think it does work. You've got to have metrics. You've got to have it right. I like Mike's point about perverse incentives, absolutely right. And actually, I think I'm right in saying that one of the big things the NUS has been pushing for has been more kind of transparency of data and accountability and so on. And that's absolutely right. It's got to be right. You know, if I'm a student now going to university, I want to know everything about that university, right? And that's absolutely right. You should have that, and you should compel universities to put it out in a kind of standardised, easily comparable way. That's the way in which you get these things to work. So I think that can work. On the research point, I don't really know is the honest answer. I'm not going to kind of bluff my way through a question. I recognise that the two things are slightly different. I can't see any reason why you wouldn't continue to publicly fund almost all research. I think that just sits alongside any kind of system for funding teaching you want.
Okay, I'll ask. I want to get a few more questions in. I'm conscious we have probably about 10 minutes to go, so I'll try and take as many questions as I can. If we can have them as questions rather than comments. John, firstly at the back.
John Morgan, I'm a reporter at Times Higher Education. I arrived late, sorry if we already did labour and fees, but question for the whole panel, but particularly for John, where do you see sort of Labour's £6,000 fee policy? Is that sort of permanently dead and being blocked by Ed Bols?
Okay, let's take a few more.
Andrew Snowden, I'm the Vice-Chancellor's Chief of Staff at the University of Salford. I just have, I'm actually a normal student but also a BPP student, so I've done both the I've done both methods. So I'm just trying to make friends before the answer. The point I wanted to make is about the BPP cost around cost, which is you look at university. We at Salford have done this analysis, and we can save multi-millions of pounds a year by rationalising our estate. This isn't necessarily about flashy accommodation. This is about rationalising the estate. The problem is the hefty funding for capital grants has been completely removed. So now universities are forced to make higher surpluses to generate just a general maintenance of the estate and renew buildings. So my view would be, if universities can come forward with suggestions on how we can reduce costs and move to a more BPP model of infrastructure, should central government have some kind of fund to help us do that, because we don't have the money.
Thank you. Question at the front. Just pass it forward.
Stephen Webb, the candidate for Wantage and also a physicist. So a lot of what we've heard, sort of residential models, might be great if you're studying law, but there's not that many chemistry departments in this country and you often have to travel, so what have we got for them? And also, in fact, the last time I recruited, I couldn't actually get any UK applicants for the job I had on offer, so what do we need to change to the funding model to get more science graduates?
Thank you. And there's a question just over here on my left.
A very quick one.
Just a mic.
Sorry, I'm going to have to simplify enormously. One of the troubles is that with the Bologna process, the Bologna agreement, a two-year course is not regarded as a degree, and the only reason that we look at it in Britain is that we don't do enough teaching in a normal year compared to our European comparators, which makes, of course, you can compress the amount we do now into 2 years, the amount we should be doing, you can't. Sorry, I'm simplifying, so some comments on it.
Thank you. Okay, so this is a chance for sort of final comments, particularly on those questions, but also any other response to other commentators. I'll just go down the line. So, Jonathan, do you want to?
Is Labour's 6K fees blocked? I hope so. Or I certainly hope so in the way that I understand it's being modelled, which is essentially the kind of the top up from the Treasury, because as I say, that places you largely at the largesse of future chancellors, and I don't think that's the right way to do it. Andrew's point on the estate's a really, really interesting one. I'm kind of loath to suggest that kind of government always needs to be the answer to some of these things. I think there are ways in which you can, as universities, form kind of estate partnerships in order to rationalise estates. It's something that's quite common in the NHS, where they've got a similar issue with massive amount of surplus land, and actually a lot of NHS trusts are doing really quite innovative stuff to rationalise estate and free up a lot of cash for patients. So I think that's quite an interesting model. Science specialist hubs, I'm just going to pass on that question. I don't know. I wouldn't want to give a kind of answer.
Great. Toni.
Yeah. On Labour's £6 grand, maybe £6 grand, maybe not £6 grand fees, I hope that they are thinking about putting more funding into the higher education system in the UK. Some people might not want public spending to be at the whim of the Treasury, but I think probably public spending should be at the whim of the Treasury. And I'd hope that the further that we go on and the more that we want to compete internationally in a global knowledge economy, as some people might have called it 4 years ago, the more we will realise that we get a lot of return from an investment in higher education, and that it's one of the best investments you can make in terms of return for the UK economy, and that actually putting public money back into higher education institutions is excellent value for money and is a good return on investment, and we have to do that if we want to be competitive. Just quickly on the thing about choice, I mean, you can make kind of comparisons about choice in school sectors and in the NHS, and yes, there is choice for state schools and choice between which bit of the NHS you use, but you still don't have to put a sticker price on it. So why is a sticker price a precursor for being able to have choice in the sector? And I absolutely think students should be able to have choice, and I absolutely don't think that they're stupid enough to fall for flashy accommodation in prospectuses, as it was put. But actually the reality is that there are lots of institutions where the lowest cost accommodation is flashy accommodation, is ensuite accommodation with Olympic-sized swimming pools, and that is your only choice. There is no choice other than to have top-end accommodation. And the reality is we know that students who live in that accommodation actually don't have as good an experience as those students who live in shared accommodation with other students around them. And so there are some really interesting choices about what universities are deciding to do and where they're deciding to spend money and what they want to look like in their prospectuses. Do they want to look like, and do we want them to look like, a part of a higher education system that's about public value, both economic and social and individual, and for businesses and for society? Or do we want them to look like flashy hotels or car salesmen, because I don't really think that they should be either. So I guess I know what I want out of a higher education system in the UK, and I hope that that's kind of reflected in some of the plans that Labour have.
John?
Firstly, on the physics question, as a chemist myself, I sort of recognise your point. Look, the point is not to replace one monolithic one-size-fits-all system with another. So no one is suggesting that we've all now got to shift to 2-year degrees, study part-time from home or something of that sort. So clearly there's going to be variation. So yes, there will be certain types of courses. And conservatoires are obviously another set of institutions which don't grow on trees all over the country. So there's going to be specialism. There may be more variety in many disciplines for people to study part of their degree closer to home and go to more specialist areas later on, and so on. But so more variety. John, your question on Labour policy. Thankfully, I have no responsibility whatsoever for Labour policy. I mean, I would just say two things about this. I think it's very much an issue that Labour remains concerned about. I think that the £6,000 sort of aspiration, I would be fairly certain remains. I think the system, through simply finding a Treasury bung at the top, while you're throwing away £5 billion a year through debt cancellation at the bottom, doesn't look very attractive. And you've got to understand that policy was formulated at a time we didn't know how catastrophically bad the new fee system would be for the public finances. We were worried about the other consequences, but actually it turned out to be even worse than the worst critics like Heppy and others predicted that it was going to be. So the context has changed. And if I look at this, trying to be an objective as an experienced politician, I paint quite an attractive picture, I hope, of how the system could be different. It's a steady state model, okay? This is what it would be like after you'd implemented the new system down the line in about 5 to 10 years' time. Thinking about how, as a government, you can't sort of say we can change student maintenance because there's more options to study in different ways, unless those options to study exist. All you're then doing is stopping low-income students going to university anywhere. So there's a really complex job, I think, even if you like the vision I put out of working out how a government would implement it. And I think one of the real questions for Labour at this stage, even if they bought the whole dream, would be, you might think it's dangerous to think you could answer all the questions about this model with the limited resources that are available to you in opposition, and without the opportunity to sit down with Vice-Chancellors and draw on that experience. So I don't know, my guess is there's probably an aspiration to do something, but there may be balanced on the other side with, actually, if you want to be a good government, you might be better to work this through with the resources of government behind you. But that is not an informed view. I'm just looking at it, if I was an incoming minister and somebody just put my idea in front of me, I could see those would be the two arguments.
Carl, final word.
Yeah, diversity and choice, I think, are the key here to ensure that we've got a diverse system. 3-year club sol experience, as David Willicks would describe it, as well as having 2-year accelerated programmes. I think you've also got to be careful in thinking that Vice-Chancellors are objective gatekeepers of the higher education system. They're not. They're self-interested individuals who are running business units, and those who are involved in the sector are all saying, well, it's great value for money because we're not charging $57,000 that they do in Harvard. You've got to be very careful about trusting those people with the idea that fee cap should come off and that somehow they'll restrain themselves with the amount of fees that they're going to charge. There is only 1 or 2 universities that have been bold enough to say, well, our fee's low, and actually we can live on our reputation because of our links to our employers. And I'm very proud that BPP is one of those and will continue to buck the trend in that way. And in terms of the question you asked about regulation, there are loads of sharks in this pool, and I definitely agree that regulation needs to be fit for purpose with the private sector. There's very few of us that have taken on the full responsibility of regulation and signed up to everything. And those that haven't are abusing the system in some instances, and it's causing problems for the whole sector.
Can I just say that's been a fantastic and fascinating discussion, wide-ranging, a fantastic audience, and also to join me in thanking the panel.